Blood on an imported Italian marble floor is difficult to clean, but Cassian Romano had an army of staff for that. What he couldn't scrub away was the deafening silence of his traumatized young son. He terrified the city's deadliest men, yet a soft, fat nanny from Queens with a ruined apron and a blazing frying pan brought his violent emperor to its knees. She wasn't supposed to survive the week in his house. Instead, she set his entire world on fire. The Romano estate sat like a concrete fortress deep in the wooded hills of upstate New York, a sprawling monument to new money and old blood. Iron gates stood guard, flanked by men in tailored suits whose jackets bulged unnatural at the ribs. Inside, the temperature always felt 10 degrees colder than the outside world. Cassian Romano preferred it that way. Cold men did not make mistakes. Cold men did not let their emotions override their trigger fingers. At 34, Cassian was the undisputed head of the Romano Syndicate, a man whose ruthlessness was whispered about in the back rooms of every illegal casino from Manhattan to Chicago. But Cassian had a problem that neither money nor violence could solve. His 6-year-old son, Oliver. Ever since the explosive car bombing that had claimed Cassian's wife 2 years prior, an assassination attempt meant for Cassian himself, Oliver had stopped speaking. The boy was a ghost haunting the vast, echoing halls of the mansion. In the past month alone, Cassian had fired 6 nannies. They were all the same, terrified, overly manicured women who flinched every time a door slammed, or worse, looked at Oliver with suffocating pity. Cassian did not tolerate pity in his house. Enter Penelope Walsh. Penny did not look like she belonged in a billionaire Mafia boss's fortress. She was 27, perpetually exhausted, and unapologetically fat. While the previous candidates had been sleek, bird-like women in pencil skirts, Penny took up space. She had thick, heavy thighs, a broad, soft stomach, and a chest that strained against the buttons of her worn thrift store cardigan. She carried her weight not with an apology, but with a grounded solidity. She was a culinary school dropout who had spent the last 3 years drowning in her late mother's medical debts, facing eviction by the end of the week. The suspiciously lucrative nanny listing she found on a dark web-adjacent forum had been a desperate last resort. Stepping into the grand foyer, Penny immediately felt the hostile chill of the house. The head of security, a towering, scarred man named Elias Mercer, looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. "You're the 3 o'clock?" Elias grunted, his eyes lingering on her soft, rounded jawline and the sheer mass of her silhouette. "I am," Penny said, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "Penelope Walsh, I'm here to meet Mr. Romano." She was escorted into a study that smelled of rich mahogany and expensive bourbon. Cassian Romano sat behind a massive desk. He was devastatingly handsome in a brutal, sharp-edged way. Piercing dark eyes, a razor-sharp jawline, and shoulders tense with coiled violence. He didn't offer her a seat. "You have no formal childcare certifications," Cassian stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. "You dropped out of culinary school. Your credit score is abysmal." "Why are you wasting my time, Miss Walsh?" "Because I need the money," Penny answered bluntly. She refused to shrink under his predatory gaze. "And because you need someone who isn't going to treat your son like a fragile piece of glass." I read the brief. He's selectively mute. He doesn't need a therapist in a nanny's uniform. He needs someone who will just let him be a kid. Cassian's eyes narrowed. Before he could dismiss her, the heavy oak doors crept open. Oliver stood there, clutching a worn stuffed bear. He looked pale, hollow-eyed, and painfully thin. Cassian stiffened, his posture rigid. He loved his son, but he had absolutely no idea how to comfort him. Penny didn't hesitate. She didn't coo or baby talk. She simply knelt, her knees popping slightly under her weight, bringing herself to eye level with the boy. "Hi, Oliver. I'm Penny. I'm basically a giant human marshmallow, and I give excellent hugs, but only if you want one. If not, I'm also really good at making incredibly gooey macaroni and cheese." Oliver stared at her. Slowly, his eyes drifted down to her soft, protruding stomach, then back to her face. He didn't smile, but he didn't run away either. He took a single, hesitant step toward her. Cassian watched, stunned. Oliver hadn't approached a stranger in 2 years. "You're hired," Cassian said sharply. "A trial week. Do not make me regret this." Penny's trial began immediately. By 6 o'clock, she decided the oppressive, sterile kitchen needed life. It was a chef's dream. 6-burner Viking range, marble countertops, but it looked completely unused. Deciding to fulfill her macaroni and cheese promise, Penny went to work. She was in her element, moving her heavy body with surprising grace as she grated sharp cheddar and whisked a roux. But the high-end industrial stove was temperamental. As she turned away to grab a pinch of paprika, a sudden flare-up caught the edge of a grease-splattered towel she'd set too close to the burner. Flames shot upward with a furious hiss. "Oh, son of a..." Penny grabbed the heavy iron skillet, trying to smother the fire, but she knocked over a bottle of olive oil, fueling the blaze. Smoke billowed up, setting off a deafening alarm. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Within seconds, Cassian burst into the kitchen, a customized Glock 19 drawn and leveled at the smoke, ready to execute whatever assassin had breached his home. 3 armed guards crowded in behind him. Through the haze, Cassian saw Penny. Her face was smeared with soot, her hair escaping its messy bun, furiously beating a flaming towel with a large metal spatula. "What the hell is going on in here?" Cassian roared, lowering his weapon, his chest heaving. Penny turned, gasping for breath, the fire finally extinguished behind her. "The burner runs incredibly hot. I was just making dinner." Cassian marched toward her, his face a mask of absolute fury. "You nearly burned my house to the ground on your first day. You are reckless, incompetent, and..." A sound cut through his rage. It was small, breathless, and melodic. Cassian froze. Penny froze. The armed guards in the doorway turned their heads. Sitting on one of the high velvet bar stools, Oliver was holding his hands over his mouth, his small shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying. He was giggling. The sight of his large, chaotic nanny, violently fighting a kitchen fire with a spatula, had broken through the boy's impenetrable walls. It was the first time Oliver had laughed since his mother died. Cassian stared at his son, all the anger draining from his body, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering shock. He slowly turned his gaze back to Penny, who was awkwardly holding the blackened, ruined spatula. "Dinner," Cassian said, his voice strangely hoarse. "Is it 7? Don't burn the pasta." Surviving the first week at the Romano estate required Penny to develop a very specific set of rules. Rule 1. Never ask what is inside the heavy duffel bags the men load into the black SUVs at 3 a.m. Rule 2. Ignore the bloodstains occasionally found on the hem of Cassian's custom-tailored suits. Rule 3. Focus entirely on Oliver. Despite the looming danger of her employer's profession, Penny found herself deeply attached to the little boy. Oliver remained mute, but he communicated with her through tugs on her oversized sweaters and bright, expressive eyes. He liked resting his head against her soft, plush stomach while she read him stories, finding comfort in the physical warmth and cushioning that his cold, statuesque father could not provide. But Cassian Romano was not ignoring Penny. In fact, he was becoming dangerously obsessed with her. From the safety of his office, Cassian frequently watched the security feeds. He watched her dance around his kitchen, unapologetic in her size. He watched how her thick thighs shifted under her skirts, how her heavy breasts rested against the counter when she leaned over to help Oliver with a puzzle. In Cassian's world, women were currency, thin, surgically perfected, and entirely compliant. Penny was loud, messy, large, and fiercely defiant. She argued with his head of security. She demanded better groceries. She was a storm of domestic chaos in his violently structured life, and it ignited a dark, primal hunger in him that he hadn't felt in years. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. on a rainy Thursday when the carefully maintained boundaries between them began to crack. Penny couldn't sleep. The lingering anxiety of her unpaid debts and the sheer surrealism of living with a Mafia boss kept her tossing and turning. She padded down to the kitchen in an oversized t-shirt and loose sweatpants, her bare feet silent on the marble. She decided a midnight grilled cheese was the only cure for insomnia. She had just buttered the sourdough when the heavy oak door creaked open. Cassian stepped into the kitchen. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight. He had shed his suit jacket, and his white button-down shirt was unfastened at the collar. Penny's breath hitched as she noticed the dark crimson stain seeping through the fabric at his left bicep. "You're bleeding," she blurted out, dropping the butter knife. Cassian glanced down at his arm, as if just noticing it. "It's a graze. A minor disagreement at the docks. Go back to bed, Penelope." "It needs to be cleaned," she insisted, her maternal and culinary instincts aggressively overriding her common sense. She marched over to the industrial sink, grabbed a clean towel, and ran it under warm water. "Sit." Cassian's dark eyes locked onto hers. Nobody ordered him around, ever. But there was something in her fierce, protective glare that commanded obedience. Slowly, he walked over and sat on the kitchen island stool. Penny stood between his spread knees, bringing her very close to him. She could smell cordite, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of blood. Her hands trembled slightly as she unbuttoned the top half of his shirt and slid it off his shoulder, exposing heavily muscled, tattooed skin. She carefully dabbed at the bloody scrape on his bicep. Cassian didn't flinch from the pain. He barely felt it. Every ounce of his focus was on the woman standing between his legs. The proximity was intoxicating. Her soft, heavy stomach brushed gently against his thighs as she leaned in. He could feel the heat radiating from her lush, full body. "You are surprisingly bossy for a woman who nearly burned down my kitchen," Cassian murmured, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an undeniable dark energy. "And you are surprisingly accident-prone for a terrifying crime lord," Penny shot back, though her voice wavered. She taped a large bandage over the wound. "There. You'll live." She tried to step back, but Cassian's large, calloused hand suddenly shot out, gripping her thick hip. His fingers pressed firmly into her soft flesh, anchoring her in place. Penny gasped, her eyes flying up to meet his. "You don't flinch when you see blood," Cassian said softly, his thumb slowly tracing the curve of her hip through her sweatpants. "You don't cower when my men walk the halls armed. Who exactly are you, Penelope?" "I'm just a nanny," she whispered, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The heat between them was suffocating, heavy with unspoken desire. "You are a liar," he countered softly, leaning forward until his lips were inches from hers. "And you are driving me completely insane." Before he could close the distance, the sharp buzzing of a cell phone shattered the tension. Cassian stiffened, his eyes darkening as he released her hip. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his expression instantly shifting back to the cold, merciless boss. He stood up, buttoning his ruined shirt. "Finish your sandwich, Penelope, then go to sleep." He turned and strode out of the kitchen, leaving Penny breathless, clutching the counter to support her shaking legs. She needed to calm down. She turned back to the pantry to grab the salt, her hands still trembling from his touch. As she reached behind the large ceramic flour canister, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic that didn't belong there. Frowning, Penny pulled it out. It was a cheap, disposable burner phone. Taped to the back of it was a small hand-drawn map of the estate's security camera blind spots. Penny's blood ran cold. Someone inside the house, someone with intimate access to the kitchen and the security layout, was feeding information to an enemy. Just as the realization hit her, she heard a faint scrape of a shoe behind her. "You shouldn't have found that, Penny," a low voice said from the shadows. She spun around, dropping the phone onto the marble floor. Standing in the doorway, stepping out from the dark hallway, was Elias Mercer. Elias Mercer stepped fully into the dim light of the kitchen, the heavy silencer of a Heckler & Koch USP gleaming dully in his right hand. The man who was supposed to be the impenetrable shield of the Romano family looked entirely too relaxed, a chilling smile playing on his scarred lips. The smell of burning sourdough bread filled the air as Penny's abandoned sandwich charred on the hot cast-iron griddle. Penny's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She slowly backed up until her heavy hips hit the edge of the marble island. She was terrified, but she was also a woman who had spent her life surviving eviction notices, predatory debt collectors, and the crushing weight of poverty in Queens. She did not freeze. Her mind raced, cataloguing the weapons around her. The heavy Le Creuset Dutch oven, a block of Wusthof chef's knives, and the sizzling pan of butter behind her. "Thomas Gallagher pays remarkably well for inside access," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly sneer. "The Irish have been trying to crack Cassian's fortress for 2 years. All it took was a few blind spots on the camera feed and an unlocked service door. But you just had to go looking for midnight snacks, didn't you, Penelope?" "You're betraying the man who trusts you to protect his child," Penny said, her voice shaking, but her chin held high. "Oliver is 6 years old, Elias. Whatever war Cassian is fighting with the Gallaghers, that little boy has nothing to do with it." "Collateral damage is a reality of the business," Elias replied coldly, raising the weapon and pointing it squarely at Penny's chest. "It's a shame. I actually liked your macaroni and cheese. Turn around. Face the sink. This will be quick." Penny didn't turn around. She looked at the gun, then up at Elias's dead eyes. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, flooded her veins. With a sudden, violent sweep of her arm, she grabbed the heavy handle of the cast-iron griddle, holding her ruined, smoking sandwich, and hurled it directly at Elias's face, a spray of boiling butter flying through the air. Elias shouted in agony as the scalding grease hit his eyes. He fired blindly, the suppressed gunshot making a sharp thwip sound as the bullet shattered the custom backsplash inches from Penny's head. Before Elias could recover his aim, the kitchen doors burst open with explosive force. Cassian Romano moved faster than Penny's eyes could track. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room like a predatory shadow, driving his shoulder into Elias's chest with the force of a freight train. The two massive men crashed into the Sub-Zero refrigerator, the stainless steel denting under the brutal impact. Elias's gun skittered across the floor. Cassian drove a devastating right hook into Elias's jaw, the sickening crunch of bone echoing in the large room. He followed it with a knee to the traitor's ribs, dropping Elias to the imported marble floor. Cassian stood over him, his chest heaving, his dark eyes entirely devoid of humanity. He pulled his customized Glock 19 from the waistband of his trousers and pressed the barrel directly against Elias's bleeding forehead. "Give me one reason not to paint my floor with your brains," Cassian hissed, his voice a lethal, terrifying whisper. "The Gallaghers are already on their way," Elias coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the pristine white tiles. "You're a dead man, Cassian. Your empire is crumbling. Thomas sends his regards." Cassian's jaw ticked. Without a word, he struck Elias across the temple with the heavy butt of the pistol, knocking the man unconscious instantly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Penny's ragged, gasping breaths. She was sliding down the side of the kitchen island, her legs finally giving out beneath her heavy frame. She wrapped her thick arms around her knees, trembling uncontrollably. Cassian turned to her, the cold, murderous rage instantly vanishing from his features, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. He holstered his weapon and dropped to his knees in front of her. His large hands gripped her shoulders, his thumbs wiping a smear of soot from her cheek. "Are you hit? Penelope, look at me. Are you bleeding?" His voice was frantic, his dark eyes scanning her soft, rounded body for any sign of injury. "I threw a grilled cheese at him," Penny sobbed, a hysterical laugh escaping her throat. "I threw a sandwich at a hit man." Cassian let out a shaky breath, pulling her forward and crushing her against his chest. Penny buried her face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of his expensive cologne and the metallic tang of violence. His arms wrapped around her broad, soft back, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He pressed a fierce, lingering kiss to the crown of her messy hair. "You are magnificent," Cassian murmured against her skin. "But we have to leave now. If Elias compromised the perimeter, this house is a tomb." Heavy footsteps pounded down the stairs. Two of Cassian's loyal lieutenants, Arthur and Briggs, rushed into the kitchen, their assault rifles drawn. They took one look at Elias's unconscious body and lowered their weapons, awaiting orders. "Zip-tie him and throw him in the trunk of the Audi," Cassian barked, his voice returning to the icy command of a Mafia boss. "Briggs, grab Oliver. Pack nothing but essentials. We are burning the protocols. We move to the Catskills property in 3 minutes." Penny pulled back, her eyes wide. "What about the police?" Cassian looked at her, his expression grim. "In my world, Penelope, we do not call the police. We survive. And I promise you, on my life, I will not let anything happen to you or my son." The armored Cadillac Escalade tore through the rain-slicked highways of upstate New York, putting miles between the Romano family and the compromised mansion. Inside the heavy, sound-proofed cabin, the tension was suffocating. Oliver lay asleep across Penny's lap, his small hands clutching the soft fabric of her sweatpants. He had slept through the gunfire, heavily dosed with children's cold medicine earlier in the evening. A small mercy in a night of horrors. Penny sat in the darkness, her hand gently stroking Oliver's hair. Beside her, Cassian was a statue of coiled tension. He was constantly on a satellite phone, barking orders in hushed, violent tones to his associates, locking down his illegal enterprises and preparing for a full-scale war with the Gallagher Syndicate. Every so often, Cassian's dark eyes would drift to Penny. In the soft glow of the passing streetlights, she looked exhausted, yet incredibly beautiful. She wasn't manicured or polished. Her lush, heavy curves spilled over the leather seats, taking up space in a way that made Cassian's chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming possessiveness. He had spent his entire life surrounded by calculating, artificial people. Penny was pure, unadulterated reality. By dawn, the SU-5 pulled off a hidden dirt road deep in the Catskill Mountains, arriving at a brutalist concrete and glass fortress built directly into the side of a cliff. The property, owned by a shell corporation named Aegis Holdings, was designed for a siege. It featured bulletproof glass, reinforced steel doors, and an independent power grid. "Welcome to the bunker," Cassian said quietly as Arthur opened the heavy vehicle doors. Inside, the safe house was stark, cold, and heavily militarized. There were no plush carpets or velvet curtains, only polished concrete floors, leather furniture, and an arsenal of high-grade weaponry locked in glass cabinets. Penny immediately went to work, softening the harsh environment for Oliver. She found extra blankets, created a makeshift fort in the corner of the living room, and distracted the boy with an iPad she found in the command center. For the first time in 24 hours, she allowed herself to breathe. Later that evening, after Oliver had finally fallen asleep in the master bedroom, Penny wandered into the industrial kitchen. She was emotionally drained, her muscles aching from the tension. She opened the stainless steel refrigerator, expecting military rations, but paused in surprise. Cassian was standing at the stove. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, the sleeves of his black dress shirt rolled up over his thick tattooed forearms. He was expertly searing 2 prime ribeye steaks in a cast-iron skillet, a sprig of rosemary and crushed garlic filling the room with a rich, savory aroma. "You cook?" Penny asked, her voice hushed with disbelief. Cassian didn't look up, carefully basting the meat with foaming butter. "My grandfather was a butcher in Hell's Kitchen before he started running numbers. He taught me that a man who cannot feed himself is a man who relies too heavily on others." "Sit down, Penelope." Penny hesitated, then climbed onto a steel bar stool. She felt acutely self-conscious in her oversized clothes, acutely aware of her heavy thighs spreading against the metal seat. Cassian plated the steaks, setting one down in front of her along with a sharp knife and a heavy crystal glass poured with vintage red wine. He sat across from her. "Eat," he commanded softly. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The steak was perfect, rich, tender, and seasoned flawlessly. Penny groaned softly around a bite, closing her eyes in genuine culinary appreciation. Cassian watched her, his gaze heavy and dark. "You don't eat like the women in my circle," he observed, his voice dropping low. "They push lettuce around their plates and pretend they aren't starving." Penny swallowed nervously, looking down at her thick waist. "I definitely don't pretend to be starving. I know I'm not. I know I don't look like the women you usually associate with, Cassian. You don't have to point it out." Cassian's hand shot across the table, his large, rough fingers wrapping gently but firmly around her thick wrist. He stopped her from pulling away. "You misunderstand me," he said, his eyes burning with an intense, raw heat that made Penny's breath hitch. "I am absolutely captivated by you. I have spent years surrounded by ghosts, hollow people who fade into the background. You are substantial, Penelope. You are soft and fierce, and you take up exactly as much space in the world as you deserve." He stood up slowly, walking around the kitchen island until he was standing directly between her spread knees. Penny's heart hammered against her ribs. She had never been looked at like this, like she was something to be worshipped, something to be devoured. Cassian reached out, his large hands settling firmly on her wide, plush hips. He traced the curve of her body, pulling her slightly forward until her soft stomach pressed against the hard, rigid muscles of his abdomen. "You saved my life last night," Cassian whispered, leaning down until his lips brushed against her ear. "You protected my son. I don't know how to be a good man, Penelope, but I know that I am never letting you go." He tilted her chin up, his mouth crashing down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive, bruising, and desperate, a collision of two worlds. Penny gasped into his mouth, her hands tangling in his dark hair as she kissed him back with equal fervor. The contrast between his lethal, hardened exterior and her lush, giving softness was intoxicating. But the moment of passion was violently shattered. A high-pitched, screeching alarm suddenly blared through the concrete fortress, flashing red strobe lights bathing the kitchen in a harsh, bloody glow. Cassian tore himself away from her, instantly pulling the Glock from his holster, his romantic demeanor replaced entirely by the cold, ruthless killer. "Motion sensors on the eastern ridge," Arthur yelled, running into the room carrying a tactical shotgun. "Two heavily armored SUVs just breached the outer gate. The Gallaghers found us." Cassian looked at Penny, his eyes wide with a terrifying promise of violence. "Get in the reinforced panic room with Oliver, lock the steel door, and no matter what you hear, Penelope, do not come out." The blaring alarm of the bunker cut through the romantic tension like a physical blade. The heavy red strobe lights spun violently, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the industrial kitchen. Cassian's transition from a passionate lover to a cold-blooded killer was instantaneous. He shoved a spare magazine into his Glock, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked furiously near his ear. Penny didn't freeze. The adrenaline from the kiss instantly transmuted into a fierce, maternal terror. She turned and ran down the polished concrete hallway toward the master bedroom, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. She threw open the door to find Oliver sitting up in the center of the massive bed, his hands covering his ears, his eyes wide with a familiar, paralyzing horror. The boy was flashing back to the car bomb that had taken his mother. "I've got you, Ollie," Penny said, her voice remarkably steady. She scooped the 6-year-old into her arms. Despite his age, he was light, fragile. She pressed his face into the soft, deep curve of her neck, letting her heavy, warm body act as a physical shield against his terror. She carried him to the back of the walk-in closet, pulling aside the false wall to reveal the heavy, reinforced titanium door of the panic room. She punched in the code Cassian had given her just hours earlier. The door hissed open, revealing a sterile 6x6 steel box equipped with independent ventilation, monitors, and survival rations. She stepped inside, hitting the emergency lock button. The heavy bolts slammed into place with a deafening, final thud. Inside, the screaming alarm was muffled, reduced to a dull, distant throb. Penny sank to the floor, pulling Oliver onto her lap. She wrapped her thick arms securely around him, rocking him back and forth. "It's okay, baby. We're safe in here. Your dad is going to handle it. He's the toughest guy in the world, remember?" Oliver clung to her oversized sweater, burying his face in the soft, plush expanse of her chest. His breathing began to slow, grounded by the steady, heavy rhythm of Penny's heartbeat. Outside the panic room, the safe house had transformed into a war zone. Thomas Gallagher had not sent a warning. He had sent a hit squad. The outer reinforced glass of the living room shattered under the relentless assault of heavy automatic gunfire. Cassian crouched behind a solid concrete pillar, his tactical rifle raised. Arthur and Briggs covered the flanking corridors. "They brought breaching charges!" Arthur shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire, discharging his shotgun into the shadows of the tree line. "Hold the choke point at the foyer," Cassian roared back, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. He leaned out, firing 2 precise, lethal bursts into the darkness, dropping a heavily armored Gallagher enforcer who had managed to scale the terrace. Cassian's mind was a deadly supercomputer, calculating angles, ammunition, and enemy numbers. But beneath the ice-cold exterior of the Mafia boss, a frantic, terrifying fire burned. Penelope, Oliver. He had to protect them. The thought of Gallagher's men getting their hands on the soft, brave woman who had just kissed him with such desperate heat made his blood turn to liquid nitrogen. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the foundation of the house. Dust and concrete debris rained from the ceiling. "They blew the Eastern Service door!" Briggs yelled over the radio comms, coughing through the thick smoke. "They're in the house!" Cassian's heart plummeted. The Eastern Service door led directly to the secondary ventilation shafts that ran dangerously close to the master suite. Elias Mercer had known the blueprints. He had sold them every secret of the Romano defenses. Inside the panic room, Penny felt the violent tremor of the explosion. The solitary light bulb flickered, then died, plunging them into absolute darkness for 3 agonizing seconds before the dim, green emergency backup lights engaged. Then she heard it. It wasn't the muffled gunfire from the front of the house. It was a sharp, metallic scraping, coming from directly above them. Penny looked up at the reinforced air vent set into the ceiling of the panic room. The metal grate rattled. Someone was unscrewing the bolts from the outside. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. The panic room was a vault, but a vault was only as strong as its weakest point. She carefully shifted Oliver off her lap, placing him in the corner behind a stack of water crates. "Ollie, stay right there," Penny whispered fiercely, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Do not make a sound." She stood up, her heavy thighs burning as she quickly scanned the small room. There were no guns inside. Cassian had kept the armory separate to prevent accidents. The only items were survival gear. Penny ripped open a heavy plastic bin and grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a solid steel emergency crowbar. Above her, the vent cover suddenly gave way, crashing to the floor. A pair of heavy combat boots dropped through the opening, followed by the hulking frame of a man dressed in black tactical gear. It was Finian Boyle, one of Gallagher's most notorious and vicious enforcers. He landed with a heavy grunt, standing up in the cramped space. He pulled a serrated hunting knife from his belt, an ugly, cruel smile twisting his face as he looked at Penny and the boy cowering behind her. "Well, well," Finian chuckled, his thick Irish brogue dripping with malice. "Thomas said to leave no survivors. Looks like I hit the jackpot." Penny gripped the crowbar with both hands, stepping directly between Finian and Oliver. She was terrified, but she was entirely immovable. Her large, soft body blocked the assassin's path completely. "You are not touching him," Penny snarled, her voice dropping to a guttural, primal pitch she didn't know she possessed. Finian laughed, lunging forward with the knife aimed straight for her stomach. Penny didn't dodge. She used her weight. As the assassin lunged, she pivoted her hips, letting the blade slice through the loose fabric of her sweatpants and graze her thigh. In the same motion, she swung the heavy steel crowbar with every ounce of strength in her thick arms, bringing it down squarely on Finian's knee. Bone cracked with a sickening snap. Finian screamed, his leg buckling beneath him, but he was a professional killer. As he fell, he wildly swung his arm, the heavy handle of his knife catching Penny across the jaw. The blow sent her crashing against the steel wall. The world spun in a dizzying array of green light and sharp pain, but Penny refused to stay down. She tasted blood. She saw Finian reaching for a sidearm strapped to his ankle. Before the enforcer could draw his weapon, the heavy titanium door of the panic room hissed and violently blew inward. Cassian stood in the doorway, a terrifying vision of absolute violence. His face was smeared with concrete dust and blood, his dark eyes entirely hollowed out by a murderous rage. He didn't hesitate. Before Finian could even raise his sidearm, Cassian fired twice. The deafening reports echoed brutally in the small steel box. Finian collapsed to the floor, instantly dead. Cassian immediately dropped his weapon, falling to his knees beside Penny. He ignored the dead assassin completely. His large, calloused hands framed Penny's face, his thumbs gently wiping away the blood trickling from the split on her jaw. "Are you hurt? Where are you hit?" he demanded, his voice breaking, a sound so raw and desperate it brought tears to Penny's eyes. "I'm okay," Penny gasped, leaning into his touch. "My leg, just a graze. He didn't get to Oliver." Cassian looked over her shoulder. Oliver was trembling in the corner, but he was unharmed. Cassian let out a jagged exhale, pulling Penny into his chest for a brief, crushing second. "We can't stay here. The house is completely overrun. Arthur and Briggs are holding the line at the stairs, but we have to go out the emergency egress into the woods. Now!" He helped her up. Penny's leg throbbed where the knife had sliced her thigh, but she ignored the burning pain. She scooped Oliver up, settling him onto her wide hip. Cassian led them out of the panic room and down a narrow, hidden concrete corridor that sloped downward. He pushed open a heavy iron door at the end, and the bitter, freezing wind of the Catskill Mountains hit them like a physical wall. A blizzard had rolled in, blinding and chaotic. The snow was already knee-deep. "Keep directly behind me," Cassian shouted over the howling wind, keeping his rifle raised as he forged a path through the heavy snowdrifts. The escape was agonizing. Penny was a large woman, unused to intense physical exertion. Her lungs burned with the icy air, and her thick thighs ached with every step as she trudged through the deep snow, carrying the dead weight of a terrified 6-year-old. The graze on her leg bled sluggishly, stinging against the cold. But she didn't stop. She didn't complain. She focused entirely on the broad, dark silhouette of Cassian Romano moving ahead of her, matching her breathing to the crunch of his boots. Cassian glanced back constantly. He saw her struggling, saw the exhaustion painting her face, but he also saw an unbreakable, magnificent determination. She wasn't slowing down. She was a fortress of soft flesh and iron will, protecting his son with a fierce devotion that humbled him. They pushed through the dense pines for nearly a mile until they reached a frozen, isolated creek bed. The gunfire from the house had faded into the distance, muffled by the howling blizzard. Cassian signaled for them to stop beneath the massive, sheltering branches of an ancient spruce tree. He stripped off his heavy tactical jacket and wrapped it around Penny and Oliver, leaving himself in only his black shirt and tactical vest. "We wait here," Cassian murmured, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I have an extraction team coming to these coordinates. 10 minutes, Penny nodded, sinking heavily to the base of the tree, pulling Oliver tight against her warm stomach to share her body heat. But their sanctuary was broken by the sound of crunching snow. Out of the whiteout, a solitary figure emerged. It was Thomas Gallagher himself, flanked by two massive attack dogs on heavy chains. He was an older man, distinguished and impeccably dressed in a heavy wool overcoat, but his eyes were cold and reptilian. "You always were a hard man to kill, Cassian," Thomas called out over the wind, stopping 20 yards away. He held a customized, long-barreled magnum. "But I knew you'd make for the creek bed. Predictable." Cassian stepped forward, placing his body entirely between Thomas and the tree where Penny hid. He raised his rifle, only to hear the hollow, empty click of a dry chamber. He had used his last round securing their escape from the house. Thomas smiled, a chilling sight. "Out of ammunition. A fitting end for the great Romano Empire. And I see you brought the help." He gestured toward Penny. "A fat nanny and a broken boy. Pathetic." Penny felt a surge of rage so pure it temporarily erased her exhaustion. She carefully set Oliver down in the hollow of the tree roots. "Stay," she mouthed to the boy. She stood up, stepping out from behind the trunk. She looked terrible, bruised, bleeding, her clothes torn, her hair a wild, snowy mess. But she stood tall, her heavy chest heaving, refusing to let this man insult the child she had come to love. "She is not just the help," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. He didn't look back at Penny, but his words carried over the wind. "She is the woman I am going to marry. And you will not speak of her, or my son, ever again." Thomas threw his head back and laughed. "Touching. Truly. But you're both going to die in the snow." He raised the magnum. Before Thomas could pull the trigger, a sharp, echoing crack split the mountain air. Thomas Gallagher's eyes went wide. A small, dark hole appeared perfectly in the center of his forehead. He stood frozen for a fraction of a second, before collapsing forward into the snow, dead before he hit the ground. His dogs, spooked by the sudden noise and the fall of their master, broke their chains and scattered into the woods. Cassian spun around, his tactical instincts on high alert. Standing 10 feet behind Penny, holding Elias Mercer's discarded Heckler & Koch USP, a gun that must have fallen from Cassian's waist belt during the frantic escape, was Oliver. The 6-year-old's hands were shaking violently from the recoil, but his eyes were locked fiercely on the man who had just threatened his father and his Penny. The boy dropped the gun into the snow. For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Then Oliver looked up at Penny. His lips parted, trembling. "Penny," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse and tiny from 2 years of disuse. "Cold." Penny let out a shattered sob. She rushed forward, falling to her knees in the snow and sweeping the boy into a massive, desperate hug. Cassian was there a second later, dropping to the ground and wrapping his arms entirely around the two of them, burying his face in Penny's neck, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of relief, shock, and an all-consuming love. In the freezing, bloody snow of the Catskills, surrounded by death and the ashes of his old life, the cold Mafia boss realized he had finally found his home. The rhythmic thwapping of rotor blades chopped violently through the howling blizzard. A sleek black Sikorsky S-76 helicopter descended like a dark angel over the frozen tree line, its powerful landing lights cutting through the blinding, chaotic snow. Cassian shielded Penny and Oliver from the vicious, icy downdraft, his arm locked tight and immovable around Penny's broad waist. Arthur leapt from the open side door of the chopper, his face bruised and bleeding but his eyes fiercely alert, waving them forward. They scrambled into the heated, leather-lined cabin. As the heavy doors slid shut, sealing out the freezing death of the Catskills, the adrenaline that had kept Penny standing finally crashed. She slumped against the plush beige leather seats, her heavy thighs trembling uncontrollably. Oliver stayed buried in her chest, his small fingers curled deep into her ruined, bloody sweater. Cassian didn't sit in the luxurious captain's chairs across from them. He knelt directly on the vibrating floor of the cabin, pressing his forehead against Penny's knee. For a man who ruthlessly ruled a violent underground empire, he looked entirely undone. "We're going to the private suite at Mount Sinai," Cassian ordered the pilot, his voice hoarse and raw. He keyed his comms unit to speak to his remaining loyal men. "Call Dr. Aris Caldwell. Tell him I need the entire VIP wing cleared, and find out what happened to Elias Mercer's body in the trunk of the Audi." "Elias is secured in holding, boss. He'll be dealt with tonight," Arthur replied grimly, tossing a heavy, heated wool blanket over Penny's trembling shoulders. The flight back to Manhattan was a blur of utter exhaustion and quiet, miraculous tears. Halfway to the city, Oliver shifted against Penny's plush stomach and spoke 2 more words: thirsty and dad. The latter caused Cassian to break down completely. The terrifying syndicate leader buried his face in his son's neck, weeping silent, tearing sobs that shook his massive shoulders. Penny held them both, her soft, generous body acting as the unshakable anchor for the 2 broken Romano men. Hours later, the violent chaos of the mountains had transformed into sterile, expensive quiet. Penny lay in a luxurious, heavily guarded recovery suite on the Upper East Side. Dr. Caldwell had carefully cleaned and stitched the vicious knife wound on her thick thigh, prescribing high-grade antibiotics and strict bed rest. She was currently dressed in a silk hospital gown that barely contained her lush, heavy curves, but she felt clean and, miraculously, completely safe. Oliver was asleep in the adjoining room, watched over by Briggs and 4 heavily vetted, heavily armed new guards. The heavy oak door of the suite clicked open, and Cassian walked in. He had finally washed the blood, gunpowder, and concrete dust from his skin. He wore dark, tailored slacks and a simple black Henley shirt that stretched tightly across his muscular chest and tattooed arms. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight, but his dark eyes burned with a singular, intense focus as he locked onto Penny. He approached the hospital bed slowly, carrying a thick, sealed manila folder. He set it on the polished mahogany bedside table before sitting gently on the edge of her mattress. His considerable weight dipped the bed, sliding Penny's plush hips closer to his muscular thigh. "How is the pain?" Cassian asked, his rough, gravelly voice softening entirely. "Manageable," Penny replied, offering a tired, genuine smile. "How is Oliver?" "Sleeping deeply. He asked for you right before he drifted off." Cassian paused, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "You gave me my son back, Penelope. I spent 2 long years drowning in my own failure to reach him. You walked into my pristine kitchen, set a grease fire, and brought him back to life. Then you stood in front of a bullet for him." "He's my boy, Cassian," Penny said fiercely, surprising herself with the absolute, possessive truth of the statement. "I wasn't going to let anyone hurt him." Cassian's eyes darkened with raw, untamed emotion. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently cupping her soft, rounded jaw. "I meant every single word I said in the snow." Penny's breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You said a lot of things in the snow." "I said I am going to marry you," Cassian stated, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for argument, hesitation, or doubt. "But before I can ask you to bind your life to a monster like me, I needed to completely eliminate the shadows hanging over you. He tapped the thick manila folder resting on the table. I had my accountants aggressively dig into the medical debts your mother left behind. The loan shark who was threatening to evict you, a man named Declan Rossi, operating out of Queens. He's a shell company asset for the Gallagher Syndicate. They knew you were desperate. They knew you were applying for the Romano Nanny position. They bought your debt to pressure you into becoming an inside asset if Elias Mercer failed. Penny felt the blood drain from her face, a cold shock washing over her. I didn't know. Cassian, I swear to you. I know you didn't, Cassian interrupted smoothly, his thumb tracing her bottom lip to quiet her frantic defense. If you had known, you would have thrown a heavy cast-iron skillet at them too. The point is, the debt is completely gone. Declan Rossi has been permanently relocated to the bottom of the East River, and the deed to your mother's house is fully paid off and entirely in your name. You are free, Penelope. You owe no one in this world, which means if you choose to stay with me, it is strictly because you want to. Penny stared at him, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of his protection. He wasn't just a brutal killer. He was an impenetrable shield, and he had wrapped himself entirely around her life to keep her safe. I want to stay, Penny whispered, thick tears spilling over her lashes. I want you. I want Oliver. I don't care about the danger or the syndicate, Cassian. I just want my family. Cassian let out a fractured, heavy breath, leaning down to finally capture her lips. The kiss was slow, impossibly deep, and devastatingly tender. He shifted closer, pulling her heavy, soft body against his solid chest, worshipping the lush, magnificent curves that had shielded his child from death. His hands slid down her wide waist, resting reverently on her thick, plush thighs, mindful of her fresh bandages. You are my queen, Cassian murmured against her mouth, his voice vibrating with absolute devotion. You take up every inch of my heart, Penelope. I will build an empire of iron and fire just to keep you safe. Penny wrapped her thick arms tightly around his neck, pulling the terrifying cold Mafia boss down into the giving softness of her embrace. The bitter coldness that had haunted the Romano family for years was finally permanently extinguished, replaced by a roaring, beautiful fire that would never burn out. The flames of danger and passion have finally settled, leaving Cassian, Penny, and Oliver to forge a powerful new legacy together from the ashes of their violent past. Penny proved that true strength doesn't come from an icy heart or a slender frame, but from fierce maternal love and absolute bravery. Thank you so much for experiencing this intense, heart-stopping Mafia romance drama with us. If Penny's incredible journey and Cassian's fierce devotion captured your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, romance-filled stories.